Hello, everybody. Welcome to the launch of India's first PG Diploma in Data Journalism. This is going to be India's first ever postgraduate program in data journalism. So we're very, very excited to have you. We have a very exciting event planned before us. We have Professor Steve Doig, who will be giving our keynote address, and Rukmani Srinivasan, who will be giving the special address. Before we begin, of course, I would like to hand over to the founding dean of JSJC, Professor Tom Goldstein, to welcome you all.
Thank you, Roshara. I take special pleasure in taking part in this launch, and I thank those who made it happen. Offering such a program in data journalism puts JGU on the cutting edge. So I'm going to give collective thanks to those who made today happen. And I'm going to use my time to talk briefly about the rich history of data journalism. First, let us get back to basics. I don't have it here because I'm in my apartment in Berkeley, California, but in my office in Sonipod, I have a plaque given to me by students that says, assume nothing. So that's my watchword. So I'm assuming people know nothing, know a little, and I will talk from that perspective. A key ingredient of what I call the journalistic method is letting the audience know how journalists acquire information. The question is, how do you know what you know? And good journalists tend to answer that. They have many techniques in their arsenal. They can be eyewitnesses to events. They can interview people who are eyewitnesses, or interview people who are experts. They can examine public records. Some of these techniques, of course, are more reliable than others. For a long time, some of the most thoughtful critics of journalism argued that the methods journalists used were too imprecise. Objectivity was an elusive mirage. A century ago, for instance, Walter Lippmann, a seminal thinker about journalism and many other subjects, expressed concern that journalism lacked the certitude of science. Half a century ago, Phil Meyer, a gifted working journalist turned academic, published a groundbreaking book called Precision Journalism, which many consider the progenitor of the data journalism movement. Like many other early pioneers, Meyer called for journalists to apply to journalism social science methods like statistical analysis. Precision journalism was originally known by the acronym CAR, C-A-R, computer-assisted reporting, and a very few newsrooms began to employ data specialists. CAR gained popularity as computers became smaller and faster. Ultimately, it was renamed data journalism. And it is India's first PG diploma in data journalism that we celebrate today. So now I'm going to throw it back to Roshara, and we'll get on with the program.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to hand the mic over to Professor Ashish Bharadwaj, the Dean of the Jindal School of Banking and Finance, to welcome you all.
Thank you, Ruchira. Thank you, Tom, for kicking off this program. What an amazing start. I was very carefully listening to what you were saying. I'm also very, very excited about this program, about the lineup of speakers who are going to reflect on what you said, who are going to reflect on the need for a more data-driven, fact-based approach to storytelling, which can hopefully reimagine journalism. And of course, very excited about the launch of India's first PG diploma in data journalism, which is being jointly offered by the two schools of JGU. This program is actually just another effort, collaborative effort that the Jindal School of Banking and Finance has gotten into with another school of JGU, where Our keen interest and expertise in data and technology-led approach to understand a variety of issues comes together with our journalism and communication school's incredible capability of teaching how to think critically, how to do research in the first place, and how to write and structure a story. So it's an incredible partnership. Like Tom, I'm also very optimistic about the program, which has been curated by my colleagues here, Ruchira Sen, Kishloy from the Journalism Communication School, and Shalini Goyal from the Banking and Finance School. They've spent several hours on internal discussions and very long deliberations with all kinds of stakeholders. And two of them are here today. Very delighted to see Professor Steve Doig, Ms. Rukmini. They are pioneers in the field, and I'm really looking forward to their address. As Tom said, Ruchira and Shalini are going to tell us a bit more about the program, but in a nutshell, this data journalism program is really an attempt to prepare the next generation of journalists, media professionals, communication experts. But also, if you think about it, it's an attempt to equip people working in any industry where skills of interpretation, analysis, visualization of both qualitative and quantitative data are really needed now more than ever to make informed decisions. The goal of this program is reflected in the curriculum we have built. We want to provide a very practitioner-oriented training using an approach that involves not just data-driven research skills, but techniques from several disciplines, including journalism, computational data science, critical thinking, statistics, fundamentals of economics, finance, politics, and of course, data visualization to tell an exciting story about contemporary topics of both global and local relevance. We've been seeing an increase in the use of graphs, infographics, statistics, illustrations of multi-dimensional data in digestible forms, and the news stories we read, in the industry reports we look at, and various other forms of writing. It's quite clear that using data is not only routine for journalists in the newsrooms and data experts in the industry and even in government agencies, but it's pretty much a driving force in the art of storytelling as technology platforms, as certain data softwares, data methodology in itself, and the data sources, all of these continue to expand. The Jindal School of Journalism and Communication and Jindal School of Banking and Finance indeed recognize this change and the opportunities it presents. And we really want to be at the forefront in delivering a very innovative, industry relevant skill set in data journalism. I once again thank Tom for his leadership. I thank Raj, who's here today, our founding Vice Chancellor. I thank my colleagues, Kishlay, Ruchira, Shalini, for their inputs and all the efforts that has gone into putting this one-of-a-kind program together. So with that, and again, on behalf of the Jindal School of Banking and Finance, I welcome everyone. Thank you very much. Back to you, Ruchira.
Thank you, Ashish. I would now like to welcome the Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University, Professor C. Raj Kumar, to welcome all participants to this program.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our very distinguished guests who are part of this program, Professor Steve Doig, the founding Knight Chair in Journalism at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, Arizona State University at the United States, Ms. Rukmini, a very distinguished data journalist from India, of course, my own colleagues, Professor Ruchira Sen and Professor Shalini Goyal, and also thank you to Ashish and Tom and Kishalay for putting this together. I'm personally very excited about this for a number of reasons. Every launch of a new program within the university, reflects our larger commitment towards, education, but also innovation in our academic offerings. OP Jindal Global University is at the forefront of many of these offerings, and I'm particularly delighted that we are also fulfilling a larger vision of our university, which is to promote interdisciplinarity. The fact that the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication and the Jindal School of Banking and Finance has come together to offer this postgraduate diploma in data journalism is indeed a reflection of the larger vision of the university, which is to promote interdisciplinarity. But more importantly, the fact that we have chosen this particular aspect of journalism, which is to reflect on the need for emphasizing data in all its forms and manifestations at a time when issues relating to artificial intelligence and robotics and machine learning and many other such things are increasingly dominating the political and social and intellectual and civic discourse in India, but also around the world. In fact, one of the remarkable things about what this program is going to do is really to empower a range of individuals, and not only limited to journalists, but also others who are broadly interested in public policy and governance, to understand how they can effectively use data for the purposes of pursuing truth and, of course, write stories about what is actually going on. There are numerous interesting examples in contemporary times where this has been very handy. All of us remember the Paradise Papers, the journalistic investigation that from the International Consortium of International Journalists, where software that was developed in digital humanities work at Stanford was actually used in a very effective manner. And of course, there are the more prominent version of it is the Panama Papers, in which data journalism was a very significant, it was significantly used. And I very vividly remember a German newspaper, Süddeutsche Zeitung, had first got access to a number of materials, millions of documents from an anonymous source, which in turn was used to develop a huge framework which involved nearly 400 journalists from 75 plus countries, where a lot of data had to be accessed, compiled, analyzed, assessed, and usefully published later. So in some ways, as we look at the future, while the core aspect of journalism will be to speak truth to power and to continuously work in making power holders accountable, increasingly this accountability that needs to be pursued with regard to power holders in all its forms and manifestations is not only going to be limited by opinions, but opinions backed by data, opinions backed by data that could be accessed, understood, and even analyzed with a view to individuals understanding it in a more easy manner. So that's why the fact that the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication, which is at the forefront of journalism studies in India, has collaborated with the Jindal School of Banking and Finance with the view to offer this program. I strongly believe that this program, while pitched as a postgraduate diploma program, which has a lot of interest among journalists, but also I would like to say that those students and those professionals who are interested to pursue the program, working with an aspiration to work for non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, think tanks, research institutions, and United Nations and other such bodies. This has a much wider appeal when it comes to the kind of courses and programmatic framework that both the schools have evolved. I'm very pleased to see that the course is offered both at an executive level for working professionals and also in a non-residential manner, and also for those who intend to stay on campus and pursue this as a more full-time program. It offers a lot of flexibility. It has also taken into account the blended learning frameworks that all of us have gotten used to. So I think there are few opportunities that are available for young people to pursue in a more creative and innovative manner. And I would like to say that the postgraduate diploma in data journalism is one such program. I would like to congratulate and indeed appreciate the deans of both the schools and also the faculty members who have conceived and launched the program today. I do believe that this program will have great resonance for a number of people who intend to use data more effectively with a view to advance their own journalistic responsibilities, but also their ethical responsibilities as a journalist as well. So with those words, I would like to once again congratulate both the schools, but also welcome our distinguished speakers Professor Doig and Ms. Rukmini. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raj. Now to begin to introduce Professor Doig, and I've tried to make the introduction as short as possible so that I don't take up too much time, but it's very difficult to introduce Professor Doig in a few words. Professor Steve Doig is an award-winning investigative data journalist and educator. He was the founding Knight Chair at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. Following a long career of 23 years as a journalist, where he received a number of awards, the Pulitzer being just one, Professor Doig became a journalist and an educator. He has curated several courses, including a sports data analytics course and a media research methods course. He's on the board of the Investigative Reporters and Editors. He is also a juror for the Phil Meyer Award for Precision Journalism. Therefore, I would like to welcome Professor Doig to deliver the keynote address for today's inaugural lecture.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Sen. And thank you all for this invitation to talk with you on this important occasion. I'm very honored to be chosen to help launch this innovative program at Jindal Global University. And I hope what I can do right now is offer just a few words of wisdom based on my own experience as a data journalist. I'm not going to try and teach here how to do data journalism. That's really what the professors and guest speakers and reading assignments and practical exercises will do in this program. But I do want to lay some groundwork here about why smart journalists, like you expect to have as your students, should want to use the power of data journalism. To me, the real power of data journalism is that it lets us use evidence rather than just anecdotes to be the strong core of our work. Imagine you wanted to do a story about a significant social problem, like crime or hunger or poverty or inadequate health care. Without data, the best you can do is just find a few examples of the problem to illustrate it, and then suggest somewhat vaguely that, well, there may be lots more of it out there. But with the right data, we can analyze the patterns in it to measure the extent of the problem. And those patterns can tell us, and ultimately our readers and viewers and listeners, how common the problem is, who is most affected by it, and perhaps lead to ideas about how to cure the problem. So before data journalism began to spread in our profession, stories about such problems usually came about as coverage of some sort of official report or study done by government or perhaps by academics. Stories like that are easy and safe for journalists because you really are merely quoting what some other expert actually is claiming is true. But the downside of this kind of reporting is that you are at the mercy of those experts. They get to decide which problems they want to study and when they want to do such studies. But when we learn the tools of data journalism, we can do such studies ourselves with the freedom to pick the problems that we want to examine and the questions we want to answer. We get to set the agenda without having to wait for government or other researchers to act. A very early proponent of this kind of reporting, as Professor Goldstein told you, was Phil Meyer, who was then a reporter for the Knight Ridder chain of newspapers. In the 1960s, Phil began doing scientifically sound public opinion surveys about the struggle for civil rights for Black Americans following riots in cities like Miami and Detroit. Phil's interest in gathering data and using statistical tools to evaluate it led him to write that book that Dean Goldstein talked about in 1972, called Precision Journalism. But arguably, he was early by about 10 years too much, because the ideas he were pushing at the time could only be done on computers that were big, expensive mainframes. It needed the small data computer revolution to really let it kick off. So for me, I became a data journalist really before there was a name for this specialty. I was a young reporter for Miami Herald, which at the time certainly was one of the best regional newspapers in the United States. My newsroom colleagues were a bunch of other young, smart, aggressive journalists who would go on to win major prizes like Pulitzers and so on, and be hired away by papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. To compete in a newsroom like that, you needed to have a superpower of some kind. I wasn't the best writer. I certainly wasn't the best at interviewing or the best at developing inside sources. But it turned out that my superpower was a growing ability to understand math and statistics and to work with data. And this really started when I bought my first computer in 1982. It was an Atari 800, which I bought as a hobby to play with at home. My wife said, "Oh my God, you spent $2,000 for this toy. What possible use could it be?" As I learned how to use it, I began to see ways it could actually help me do my job better, much as Phil Meyer had proposed. So at the time, I was covering state government. I was focused on topics like budgets and taxes and elections. So I began to use early spreadsheet software and simple computer programming to find patterns in such data that I could use in my stories. For instance, an always important story in US legislatures is how money from special interest groups influences the laws and regulations that get passed. I could use my little computer to match the votes of lawmakers for or against measures to the amount of money they were receiving from the people who were for or against those issues. It will not surprise you that we could see in the patterns the strong effect of money in influencing how the lawmakers voted. And my stories were stronger because I could measure the evidence of that effect. During my first few years of this kind of reporting, there was only a handful of other reporters around the US who had also stumbled into data journalism like I did. We didn't know each other, and we didn't have the internet to share ideas and techniques. But starting in the late 1980s, a few big data-heavy projects began to get attention. One of these was a project called The Color of Money, in which a young reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution newspaper used data about home mortgage loans in the city to prove that the banks there were deliberately refusing to lend money to Black residents to buy homes. The story was so powerful that it earned the Pulitzer Prize, which caught the attention of investigative reporters around the country when they realized that they needed to learn how to do this kind of reporting. Another early big data project that helped sell the idea of data journalism involved the Miami Herald's coverage of the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew. This giant storm hit Miami in 1992 and caused billions of dollars in damage. By this time, I was pretty good with data analysis, having done a number of smaller data stories for the Miami Herald. So I began to use my data analysis skills to examine the damage patterns from the storm. I was able to prove a key finding, that the newer homes were more likely to be destroyed than older homes were. And we also use, We also used data to explore why that pattern happened. And we learned that it was because building codes had been weakened over the years by local officials who were influenced by money from the building industry. We also could use data to show that building inspections were done badly and in haste. Our project, called What Went Wrong, won the Pulitzer Prize for public service that year and served as another wake-up call to reporters who wanted to do powerful work. Let me describe a few other data stories I did to give you an idea of the range of topics that can be addressed if you find and gather interesting data. One of these, for example, focused on Miami's then horrible murder rate, which was the worst in the country at the time. Crime was everywhere, thanks to drug smuggling and, frankly, America's too ready access to guns and other weapons. So early one year, I went to the various police forces in the Miami area for information about every one of the more than 350 murders that had occurred the previous year. And I built a database on a spreadsheet with all the details I could find about each victim, including name, gender, age, race, location, type of weapon used, whether an arrest was made, and so on. It allowed me to make a map color-coded by the number of murders in each postal code area, and to make summary tables showing demographic information about the victims of the crimes in general. A year later, I was able to use this database again. I went back to each case to see what had happened, if anything, to bring justice to the killers. I discovered, for instance, that arrests had been made in only about half of the cases, and the likelihood was that many cases would never be solved. It's a good example of how old data can still produce new stories. Another story I did looked at how property taxes in Miami were being unfairly collected, so that rich people were being taxed on only a fraction of the value of their property. Property taxes in many American cities fund important government functions like the schools, and arguably everyone ought to pay their fair share. Property taxes are based on the value of each home, so that the owner of a home that was twice the value of another home ought to be paying twice as much in property taxes. But the difficulty is in how the value is decided. There is a public official called the property appraiser who's supposed to use information like recent sales prices of similar homes to set the values of each home in the city. But I did an analysis comparing recent sales prices of homes to their appraised values and could see that the expensive homes were being systematically assessed for substantially less than their actual sale prices. This essentially is a tax break for the rich, and my analysis proved it was happening. I'll add that data journalism isn't just for heavy-hitting investigative stories about crime in the streets and misbehavior of public officials. One of the best-read data stories I ever did involved my analysis of dog licenses in Miami. Each record in the license database included such information as the dog's breed, gender, age, and name, and the address of the dog's owner. With that data, I was able to do tables showing the most popular breeds and the most popular names of dogs of each breed. It showed that people weren't very creative with names. For instance, there were hundreds of collies named Lassie. I found that the two most popular breeds were poodles and pit bulls, which says something about Miami, I guess. Anyway, people love their pets, and this story and the accompanying tables gave them plenty to read about and discuss. I'll also point out that the local dog license stories have since been done again and again by data reporters around the country. By the way, this pattern of copying interesting stories ideas done elsewhere is a good thing. I've always believed that if a story was important in one city, chances are the same topic will be a good story for some other locality. Over my years at the Herald and since joining my university, I've done myself or helped others with all sorts of data stories. They've involved topics like voting patterns in political elections, or dangerous traffic intersections, air and water quality problems, racial and gender inequities, problems in schools, sizes of crowds, and so much more. Okay, let me tell one more story about a data project I did. And this was a few years ago, and at the time I was living in Lisbon for a semester, Lisbon, Portugal, where I was teaching data journalism as a Fulbright professor. I got an email there from an editor I knew back in California who wanted some help. His reporters were working on a tip that a large chain of hospitals in California was overbilling the government for treating certain patients. And they wanted a way to prove that this was happening. Americans like to think we have the world's best medical system, but unlike most of the rest of the world, most Americans need insurance to pay for their medical care. Government-paid health care is only for people either in total poverty or seniors who are 65 years old or older. It's a system called Medicare. Doctors and hospitals get reimbursed by Medicare at different rates depending on what each patient is being treated for. So the hospitals regularly submit to Medicare databases with the details of diagnoses and treatments given each patient. Not surprisingly, more complicated cases call for higher reimbursement than for simple cases. But this system creates an incentive to cheat. So these reporters were being told by hospital workers that the workers were being ordered by their management to do what is called upcoding. This means to use codes for complicated diagnoses and treatments when in reality the case was a simpler one. But the reporters couldn't do a story based on just the word of the workers because management denied it was happening. So the editor asked me if there was a way to check out this claim using data that all hospitals had to submit each year about every patient they treated. Well, yes, I realized there was a way. So they gave me a link to download 5 years of this data for all the hospitals in California, literally millions of records. I was working on my Macintosh laptop in a dining room table in Lisbon, but with a bit of programming magic, I could see the proof we needed for this story. I'll give you an example of what I found. Elderly patients were being diagnosed, among other conditions, with malnutrition. But there are degrees of malnutrition, and the worst is a condition called kwashiorkor. This means a severe protein deficiency, and usually is seen only in starving infants living in refugee camps with their bellies badly swollen. You've seen those kinds of pictures. It's extremely rare in the United States, yet somehow these hospitals were finding an apparent epidemic of it among elderly patients in California. I used the data to compare the rate of kwashiorkor being reported by this chain of hospitals compared to the nearly non-existent rate of it at all other hospitals in the state. And when we did the story, the management insisted those cases were real. But when I analyzed the data for the next year after the story, suddenly there were no more cases being diagnosed. They realized they had been caught. This was a good example of how data analysis uncovered people who were trying to cheat the system, which means cheating the taxpayers who pay for the system. What really aggravated me about this story, though, was that my analysis, again accomplished on a small laptop computer using public data, could easily have been done by Medicare itself years before we uncovered the cheating. Indeed, so many stories of misfeasance and malfeasance that I and other reporters have done should have been something that government itself should do. Okay, enough about my stories. At the time I was doing much of my work for the Herald, data journalism was very much an American thing. It was being pushed by a training operation called NICAR, the National Institute of Computer Assisted Reporting, based at the University of Missouri's Journalism School. Reporters from Newsroom around the country began going to NICAR workshops to learn how to use early database software and to download government data collections stored on 9-track magnetic tape. And NICAR and its umbrella organization, Investigative Reporters and Editors, began holding conferences around the country where reporters could learn from each other how to do these kinds of stories. Data journalism also began to be taught at innovative journalism schools around the country. Thanks to a big grant from the Knight Foundation, Arizona State University's Cronkite School of Journalism created an endowed chair in 1996. This chair was to be filled by someone with significant experience as a data journalist. Happily, they hired me. But it wasn't going to be long before data journalism started spreading to the rest of the world. I remember my first visit to London shortly after I joined Arizona State University to do a data training talk with reporters for the BBC. I showed them a color-coded map I had done of the differing amounts of crime reported across the 33 districts of London. Well, they were amazed. How did I make such a map? Where did I get those numbers? I told them I had sat in my office in Arizona and used the internet to download the crime numbers from the website of Scotland Yard, which was down the street from BBC headquarters. Obviously, they could have done this as well, but at the time, those reporters weren't even aware that this was a possibility. Before long, however, good data projects were being done by reporters in England and Europe. International organizations modeled on NICAR began popping up in places like Norway and Sweden and Belgium. The European Union funded an organization called the European Journalism Center to improve the quality of journalism across their member nations. And the Sjc quickly became a prime source of training and help for international journalists around the world, and is still such an organization. And a growing number of international reporters started coming to the annual NICAR and IRE conferences. Well, today, evidence of the worldwide spread of data journalism can be seen in the big International Journalism Prize competition, now called the Sigma Awards. More than 500 projects were entered by large and small newsrooms from a total of 66 countries. I'll add that 2 entries on the shortlist came from India, which leads me to think there's plenty of room here for Jindal journalism graduates to make their mark in this specialty. And shortly, you'll be hearing from Ms. Rukmini Srinivasan about her pioneering work as a data journalist in India. Let me turn now to what I think you need to know to become good at data journalism. First, as I always tell my own students, the most important word in data journalism is journalism. Skill with data can make a good journalist better, but it can't make a bad journalist good. You must master the basic skills of all journalists, including the ability to recognize a good story, to ask good questions and get good answers from sources, to organize the information you gather, and to make good ethical decisions. I mentioned asking good questions. Think of data as a source, not so much different than the human sources you interview for stories. Data analysis is how we interview data, asking it questions and getting answers in terms of the patterns in the data. I also mentioned organizing information. A key skill for data journalists is to keep detailed notes on the data they acquire and analyze, including where it came from and any information about the codes that might be in the data. Some data projects can take weeks or even months to pull together. And when you make a statement in a story that was derived from earlier analysis, you want to know exactly what you did to get that bit of information. So what specific skills are necessary for good data journalism? The most basic of all would be comfort with mathematics. I'm not talking about being a wizard with calculus or trigonometry, but rather with such simple grade school math as percentage change and rates. Sadly, too many American journalists aren't comfortable even with math as simple as that. I was called professor in the Miami Herald newsroom years before I became a real professor because I could reliably calculate percentage change. I suspect few Jindal Global Journalism students will have trouble with this requirement. How about computer skills? I would say it's most important that you get very comfortable with a good spreadsheet program like Excel. Frankly, the analysis for the vast majority of data journalism stories you'll wind up doing can be done on a spreadsheet. Only if you are working with hundreds of thousands of records, or you need to join tables on a common variable, would you need to use somewhat more complicated database management program like Microsoft Access, for instance. When I say very comfortable with Excel, I don't mean you have to master everything it can do before you can start using it. I have used Excel and earlier spreadsheet programs for 40 years now, and I can touch type most everything I do on it. Yet I use at most maybe 20 of the more than 100 functions built into Excel, most of which are things where I will never need to do as a journalist, and I honestly don't even understand. My point is that you can start doing useful data analysis with the most basic of Excel functions and add new ones only when you need them. You need to write computer code to do data analysis. While coding can be a good skill to have, it's quite possible to do great data stories without having to write a single line of computer code. It is most useful if you need to scrape data from a website, for instance, but most normal analysis of data can be done with off-the-shelf menu-driven software like Excel. If you do want to learn to code for data journalism, what language should you learn? Good data journalists use any number of different languages of several for analysis. But among the most popular these days are free or cheap data coding programs like SQL, Python, and R. If you want to work in the interactive web presentation and graphics side of data journalism, then knowing how to code in JavaScript and D3 would be essential. Or so I have been told. To be honest, I don't use any of those. When I need to use code on a data problem, I turn to SAS. Unfortunately, SAS is too expensive for most newsrooms, but it's what I learned when I first needed code back in my Miami Herald days. So the lesson here is that it doesn't really matter which language you learn, because almost any of them will do the job if you become good at coding with them. And within a few years, new coding languages will come into fashion anyway. I'll add that whatever software programs and coding languages you want to learn, it's best if you use something being used by many in the wider community of data journalists. That way you can go to a listserv like NICAR-L and get quick help with a data problem. Let me wrap this up with a quick discussion of what still is a big problem for data journalists in many places in the world: actually getting data to analyze. Here in the United States, journalists have the advantage of relatively strong public records laws that require all levels of government to turn over most data sets on request. I can go to many local, state, and federal government websites and directly download useful data sets, or make a direct request for machine-readable data that some agency is collecting for whatever reason. Occasionally, a newsroom will have to go to court to enforce such public records requests, but most of those battles have long since been fought and won here. But I realize that such strong public records laws are not the norm elsewhere. I don't know enough about the laws and customs of government in India to know for sure, but I'm guessing you won't enjoy the same easy access to data that I have. With that said, the first step should always be to assume that the data you want is public and to ask for it. First, ask for it informally. If you're turned down, make the request in writing, explaining why you argue that the data should be public. Document the answer you receive, and then perhaps do a story about the refusal to release data that should be of public interest. But if that doesn't work for one set of data, where else can you get data that's useful for stories? Here's a few quick ideas. For one, there is in fact public data you can download from Indian government sites. Your Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation would be a good place to start looking. Various other Indian economics and social agencies also seem to have data available for download. Look over those data tables and you will get immediate ideas for data stories. There also are lots of international organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank that have data relevant to India. A very interesting and detailed set of data about India can be actually found in the US Census Bureau's regularly updated data sets about international trade between the United States and all other countries, including India. You can freely download such data showing what India sells to the US and what India buys from us. Another tactic for getting interesting data for stories is to gather it yourself. Just like I built that database of murders in Miami, you might find ways to gather and build modest-sized databases of incidents of interest in your area. Or automate the data collection. An example of that might be to get an air pollution meter to gather readings over time in a very local area near a school. Well, it's time to wrap this up. I said at the beginning that I'd try to give you a few words of wisdom. I gave you lots of words, and I hope at least some of them will count as wise. I'm excited for you all about the start of this program at Jindal Global Journalism. The data stories that you do will inspire other Indian journalists to learn such valuable skills, and the practice of data journalism will spread here as it has in so many other parts of the world. I look forward to seeing that happen. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Thank you, Professor Doig. That was absolutely fantastic. It was a lot of wisdom and not many words. We'll take questions after the next address, if our YouTubers do not mind. For now, I would like to introduce Rukmani Srinivasan. Rukmani Srinivasan is one of India's pioneering data journalists. She has columns in Live Mint, India Today, and India Spend. Her work speaks for itself. She combines data analysis and storytelling to inform the public about the status of healthcare, crime, and nutrition. I've just recently been drawing upon her work on the undernutrition for women just recently, because we're doing some work with Indian economists combining together to look at some of work on women's nutrition. So I was just drawing on Rukmani's work only yesterday. And of course, if you want to follow her work, you can follow her podcasts on The Moving Curve. So let me give you Rukmani.
Thanks very much, Ruchira. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and it's such a thrill for me to follow Professor Doig. It's great to hear stories from his career, very inspiring. Similarities and differences over here, and coincidentally, that it really does touch upon a lot of what I wanted to talk about, both the similarities and the differences. So my name is Rukmini S. I'm a data journalist based in Chennai. My trajectory is substantially different from Professor Doig's in that respect. I went to journalism school and I started out in Mumbai as a journalist straight out of college. An early career journalist who, Kishalay over here will remember those early years where your job was to run around the city. So that was my job, to run around Mumbai for 4 years. And it gave me the sort of experience of the nuts and bolts and levers of Indian democracy that I think nothing else would give me. And I'll talk about this in a bit, but I really do think that this sort of understanding of how the country works on the ground is invaluable when you think about data journalism, because I'm sure this exists to some degree in the US as well, but the abyss between data and reality on the ground in India is really something that journalism needs to bridge. It's not unfathomable, but it's part of the role of journalism over here. After I worked at the Times of India in Mumbai for a few years, then I did a master's, and then I moved to Delhi to join the Times of India's then small team of reporters called Times Insight Group, at the time the first dedicated data journalism team in the country. And if I reflect upon that time and now, it's very heartening to me to see the enormous change in attitudes to data journalism that I can see now in Indian newsrooms. Most Indian newsrooms with the budget to do so will employ a data journalist or a fact checker. And another big change is that you no longer need to sell a data story to an editor. These are actually stories that are being sought out. Data, even if that is not the only story being told, a data element to a broader news moment has become a vital part of Indian journalism. Additionally, not just from the point of view of newsrooms, I see a big change among readers as well. In 2013, I moved to The Hindu and then became The Hindu's data editor. At the time, the first data editor of an Indian newsroom. Now, multiple newsrooms have data editors. And one of the things that we sensed around the 2014 election was a great desire among readers to be able to cut through rhetoric and narratives to some extent. This is something that I sense to a continuing extent among readers and viewers, that a constant barrage of anecdote, opinion, rhetoric, narrative has become frustrating, and they seek some element of fact and data to cut through it. Of course, as we'll talk about further, data journalism is not exempt from the pushes and pulls that all of journalism struggles with. And there are ways to try and think about how to insulate all of journalism from these pushes and pulls. Simultaneously, there has been a crisis of credibility in the media as well, where readers push back against the positions and reporting of journalists and want to see other sides, want to see the truth for themselves. And data allows that to some extent, especially if you are able to, as you say in school, show your rough work. If you're able to show the work behind what you're putting out, it's something that I think is of great value to readers right now who don't know whom to trust, and with good reason. The other thing is that I think sometimes data journalism is sold as an answer to the questions around bias, subjectivity, that affect not just journalism but all humans. And in a way, my understanding of the role of data in this respect is to embrace in a way that bias and subjectivity are mortal failings, and to use data to move towards some degree of fairness. If fairness is the objective that we seek, then data can help move towards that. It's very inspiring for me to, hear from Professor Doig right now, because, one of the big changes that has happened in journalism in the last few years in India has been the role of tech, what Professor Doig referred to as assisted journalism, and what, I would maybe call tech-enabled journalism, is one of the big changes that we've had in the last few years. It's both inspiring and slightly depressing to listen to him, because many of the resources that that one would want are still not available to most journalists and newsrooms in this country. In that respect, it's exciting for me to think of a data journalism course where one or a group of students who then go out into the world of work could potentially bring these skills together and not have to rely on more expensive resources. Most importantly, I think, even in a resource constrained context, developing the right mindset is important. So, of course, the assume nothing mindset that Professor Goldstein spoke about, and the attitude of bringing skepticism even to stories or situations that might confirm your own biases, or your own deeply held beliefs, but being fair enough, rigorous enough, and honest enough to bring skepticism to those situations as well. So it's not just the tech you bring to it, but the mindset as well. Globally, I do think that some of the best examples, even in the last few years, of data journalism have still come from the US. In the early months of the pandemic, ProPublica brought out a wonderful investigation of the first 100 deaths in Chicago. Subsequently, academic work has established that the pandemic disproportionately affected African American and Hispanic communities in the US. But what ProPublica was able to do is sort of get a jump start on even that sort of academic analysis by just looking at the data and then physically tracking down victims and telling their story. So, really a phenomenal example of teamwork and of both data and field reporting. One of the examples that sort of held up as a classic is always the US, Guardian US's investigation into police shootings in the US, which then I believe subsequently led to a change in how police homicides were defined in the database over there. So that that was an example of producing change. Then there was a very effective graphic from the Wall Street Journal on vaccines, which sort of shows the probability or the number of cases from various infectious diseases, then the year in which the vaccine was introduced, and subsequently you can see the rapid fall in those infectious diseases. So it's one of those graphs which in the Indian context, if you had it saved as a JPEG and had it on WhatsApp, it would be very useful to share in skeptical family groups. And I don't say this lightly. This is an important part of the work of data journalism. Another example that I found very interesting, because I also have an interest in writing about crime in India, was looking at bail setting in the US. And this was by the data journalism portal 538.com. And it looked at how it followed people who might have who might be arrested for a similar charge, but because of the algorithms that bail setting was relying upon, it meant that marginalized people, women of color, were disproportionately unlikely to be given bail, for example. ProPublica did a similar investigation on these risk algorithms. So these really strike me as data journalism exercises that took a big step, and in a way did what Professor Doig mentioned, which is that they weren't reporting on existing reports. They were trying to tell an all new story by looking afresh at something that no one knew or was talking about just yet. That's some of the most ambitious forms of data journalism. In India, when you try to do that, you run up against some immediate challenges. One, of course, is access to data. So we do have, a parallel law like the FOIA in the US. We have the right to information in India, but it's much more likely to get blocked under various exemptions. The appellate process is less less reliable, and courts have not typically sided with journalists. And additionally, most news organizations don't have large pockets enough to pursue this. So as a result, a lot of data journalism in India, additionally, there is the issue of the lack of resources in terms of access to developers, tech that allows for even scraping, for example. So as a result, a lot of data journalism in India is largely reporting on reports. Hopefully this is something that the upcoming graduates from the Jindal course can break through, because that is one of the directions that we would want data journalism to be going in this country, because this is not a problem that the broader landscape of Indian journalism suffers from. Investigative journalism in India is alive and kicking, and has really told at great personal risk to journalists some of the most important stories of the last few years. So it would be great if we're able to empower data journalists to join in this and not have to rely on existing published government data. So gaining the skills to break out of this is key. I know many of us, want to be leading that. But some of the best examples of what people have been able to do so far in India, one of them is a series of stories that a reporter named Apu Estos Suresh did in the Indian Express, first in the state of Uttar Pradesh and then in Bihar, or I might have got the chronology wrong there. He did these around elections and looked at communal riots and tried to map the relationship between areas that were going in for elections and the likelihood of communal riots flaring up. Having reported on police statistics after they are finally published by the government, I know how hard it must have been to do what he did, which is to travel across the state and gather this material directly from police stations. But it was able to tell a story that published data would not have told us later. Another important thing that Indian journalists have been doing is been using databases around companies and business holdings to try and tell us a little bit about the nexus between politics and business in the country. We have much less of a culture of holding politicians to account for conflicts of interest, the sort of relationships with lobbying and voting outcomes, which Professor Doig mentioned. There's less of that, but a bit of that beginning with people who are able to use these databases. And then the right to information, which I mentioned, of course, is one of the strongest sort of tools in the skill set of many data journalists who've been able to use RTI requests quite successfully, if not to come out with new data, at least to be able to say, again, as Professor Doig said, that the story here is that we're not being given the data. So one of the things that I came up against during the pandemic is that a number of Indian states instituted audit committees to go through all the COVID deaths in their state to determine if the death should be classified as a COVID death or not, which is in contravention of WHO guidelines around COVID death reporting. So we put in RTI requests seeking the minutes of the meetings and the proceedings of these audit committees. It was denied to us, and that, in a way tells its own story as well. So my work focuses around gender, crime, politics, and inequality. At times, I also have tried to tell lighter stories. When Professor Doig was talking about the story about dog names, I was really struck by the coincidence when we used Election Commission database that was available at the time to tell stories about the most popular Indian names. And that again, is something that really connected with readers, because people were interested in knowing how names changed over time. Sports is again, and I'm not my area of expertise, but sports is again an upcoming area of data journalism in India. I have to say that I too largely use publicly available data, or at the most data sets created by universities or by large private data providers. Part of the reason is access, part of the reason is my own largely my own absence of advanced data skills. So I'm a bit relieved to hear again from Professor Doig that he considers familiarity with Excel as largely adequate, because that's where my tech skills begin and end. Sometimes this brings comfort to students, but I would want to say this is not a humble brag. If Jindal University is able to bring students' skills levels above what I'm able to do so far, that's only going to improve what happens with journalism. So at times what I have done is create my own databases. This happens rarely, but produces work that pushes the boundaries of what you're able to tell so far. So one of the pieces of work that I've been most proud of is that following the 2012 sexual assault case in Delhi, there was a long overdue, very passionate, very important conversation that began in India around sexual assault in India, not just around gender relations and the violence women face, but also around institutional mechanisms, police statistics, courts, and a sort of reckoning around what was going on and what these numbers meant and what it meant for the future. So what I was able to do is I created a database of all of the 600 or so court cases around sexual assault that were decided in Delhi's 7 district courts in one calendar year. And I analyzed them for patterns of acquittals, convictions, minors, what complainants were arguing, what defendants were saying, the lines that prosecutors were taking. I'm proud of that because I do feel that it was able to advance our understanding of sexual assault as reported, at least, as reported in police and court statistics to some extent. Another example of creating a database was around the 2014 election, where using the wide national network of the Hindus news reporters at the time, we were able to create a database of all of the incoming MPs and their family and business connections to try and establish, how much of this issue of dynasty, how it existed, who was more likely to come in with family connections, what parts of the country. That sort of jointly built database. So some of the stories that I'm proud of that I've done in the last few years, one is, as I mentioned, a series of reporting, a series of stories around sexual assault trials in Delhi's district courts. For Mint, I write largely about socioeconomic issues, and I focus on inequality. So a couple of years ago, when there was a new piece of affirmative action announced for people who were poor. So most affirmative action in India is based around caste. This was an attempt to bring in a piece of affirmative action around class and not caste. And there's multiple issues around it, but I also was able to bring in numerous data sets to point out how, in terms of all sorts of educational achievements, income, asset ownership, the quality of life in Muslims in India was really the one that was crying out for some affirmative action, but was unlikely to be covered by the new legislation that was announced. And then I have been looking significantly over the last year at the coronavirus, as everyone has across the world. One of the things that I looked at was to look at how deaths are registered systematically in India prior to the pandemic as well, and how this was likely to affect our counting of COVID deaths going forward. Who were the people we missed in the past? And was it likely that we might be missing them now as well? I was also able to look at women, how women are less likely to go in for investigative procedures to make it to hospitals at all, and whether this was likely to be having some impact on the gender differences that we were seeing in India's COVID numbers. I just want to talk a little bit more about the pandemic because I really feel it has been a key moment in India's data journalism or data story altogether. Here again, the lack of access to data in India has really been, it's one of those things that was a problem, but now because I look at data sets across the world, including in Latin American and other developing countries, you realize just how big the issue is in India. So India is the only country whose data I look at regularly that does not have a national website, government website dedicated to historic, geographically distributed COVID numbers. We, as all researchers and academics across the world, use COVID-19india.org, which is a crowd-funded volunteer, a volunteer-driven organization that puts together official statistics. It's just doing the job that the government should have been doing, but is not doing. So, it's really, this has been the moment that data journalism has been needed to do original work, because that it was not that the numbers existed and just the analysis was needed. So for example, I was able to look at through COVID-19india.org, I looked at the first 1,000 cases and was able to do some analysis of where they seem to have come from, what we knew about them, a little bit about the demographics and the geographic distribution. Similarly, as I mentioned, we've been able to look at death statistics and missing women in the total count. Another important thing has been to look at the differences between states, because there's such a vast difference in state capacity between different parts of India that it reflects in statistics. So, one of the things that you realize as you start reporting on numbers in India is that higher numbers of anything are usually a sign of better state capacity rather than worse state capacity. And just the knowledge of that complicates your understanding of numbers, but also helps you tell a more rounded story. Finally, I just wanted to talk a little about data and privilege. The point that Professor Doig made about comfort with numbers resonated very strongly with me. I don't have a number background as well, and I would agree with him that being able to do simple things like percentage changes helps you tell stories that many in your newsroom would not be able to tell. But one of the things in India particularly is that a lot of this is because of the way math is taught in schools. And what it means is that people from marginalized backgrounds, women, people with less comfort with English or math, or who have not been, taught in expensive schools, struggle with numbers and translate this in their own minds into a feeling that they can't do it, or they're not intelligent about numbers or about data. So I think it's good to accept that because of many of these reasons, a lot of data journalism will be done and produced by people with the privilege of access and the privilege of understanding how to do it. Once you own that, then thinking about what you're going to do with that power and privilege then becomes important. Thinking about whether you want to punch up or punch down with the material that you have in your hand. Thinking about what you want to do with this data to open it up to the people who don't have access to it, so that they can use it to advocate better for their own lives. Thinking about whether you want to challenge narratives around entrenched structures in the country, because every bit of journalism is choice, and it's just as much with data journalism. You're choosing the stories that you want to tell. And I would be remiss to not mention the farmers' protests going on right now. If physical classes had been going on, Sonipat would have been really in the center of it, and students would have been able to do so much reporting around it. So there's been a ton of data journalism around agriculture, farmers, the farmer protests. But these are all choices, the stories that people choose to tell. There's a variety of them. So it's important to think about power and privilege even when it comes to data and data journalism. And just a couple of ideas from me for the program going forward. One is that I'm very excited that it's centered in a university that looks at so many other things as well, because journalism and data journalism are centered in all of these power structures as well. What is data journalism without an understanding of politics, of law, of business? So it's exciting that the school will be centered among these others as well. And finally, there's no substitute for getting out there and reporting and understanding how the country works. So I'm excited to think about all of the skills that the students will get going forward, and what great journalists they'll make for future newsrooms, and also of the hard work of getting out there and reporting and understanding how India works that they should do before they get into Indian newsrooms. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rukmani, for your absolutely excellent talk. And I have many things to talk about. But before I do any of that, Professor Raj would like to thank the speakers. So over to you, Raj.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve and Rukmani. What an inspiring set of reflections and an amazing start to the program. I am deeply grateful to both of you for taking this time out and sharing your experiences, your stories, and most importantly, emphasizing the need for data in relation to the very fundamental purpose of journalism as a profession. So I sincerely hope that both of you in some form or the other associate with us in doing what we want to do. We're very keen to develop this program. And I think that what Rukmani said is important, which is that, the phobia that is associated with a lot of people with simply looking at numbers. I belong to that person, although I'm from Chennai, and most people in Chennai would end up becoming a doctor or an engineer. I decided to run away from any of that, partly because I want to run away from maths in any form. And that's why I ended up becoming a lawyer. So this is not unusual at all. And so we need to really, and the kind of things that both of you said, how we can integrate use of data in a more effective manner for advancing many other aspects of journalism is going to be very useful. So thank you so much. And I need to rush into another meeting, but I just want to quickly thank you, both of you, and as the program will continue. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
All right, we are coming to questions. I have a question here from my colleague from TIS Hyderabad, Professor Rahul Menon, who's also working on a really exciting data journalism project himself on the Indian economy. His question is to both speakers. He says, with the mainstreaming of data journalism, how important does data visualization become vis-a-vis analysis alone for journalists today? Should I go over to Steve? Actually, I'll take one more question here. This is from my colleague from JSJC, Professor Shukumar Muralidharan. He says, how far is the availability of data related to governmental needs? Is the governmental interest necessarily congruent with the public interest? Should I go over to Professor Doig first, because it's getting very late in Arizona, and then I'll come to Ms. Srinivasan.
Okay. I can answer the second question pretty quickly. Quite often, government interest is not congruent with public interest. Many of the stories that we do with data journalism scare government officials because they've never themselves analyzed that data and they don't know what we're going to discover in it. So I would say that's the case. And quickly on data visualization, I think good data visualization is a very important way to tell data stories. You don't want to have a data story that's filled with a bunch of numbers. It's much better to find a good way to create a graph that actually shows the story that you're trying to talk about. And that way you can, in the story, get to the people who are affected by it. So that's how I feel about it.
Over to you, Rukmani.
Take the first question then, which is around visualization. I see them as distinct, and it sometimes frustrates me when data visualization is conflated or equated with data journalism. It's an output choice rather than the essence of it alone. A good visualization is far easier to understand, especially for people again who struggle with numbers. And I think a lot of people who would not normally read a large news story sometimes would be moved by a particular graph. I too find individual graphs very compelling sometimes. This is part of the most resource heavy element of newsrooms. So there's the ideal and there's the pragmatic part. The ideal is that yes, having great visuals transforms what a data story is trying to tell. The pragmatic part of it being that budgets for designers and visualizers are really tight in Indian newsrooms, so that sometimes suffers. And then rather than have a poorly done chart which can be so deeply misleading and travels miles, it might just be better to have a story that tells the all-round perspective better. It shouldn't be a choice. These aren't choices, but that's what sometimes happens in a resource constrained setting.
All right. I've got a quick question from Professor Muralidharan. It's a follow-up for Rukmani because you're interested in crime statistics. He says, how much of a question is it that the classification of crime statistics has been changed quite often? How much of a problem is it that the classification of crime statistics has been changed quite often? NCRB data.
Yeah, it's a problem, and it's also something that you experience with other forms of official numbers. So you get used to doing your hygiene checks before you dive right in. it just means that the, going through the caveats and disclaimers part of it becomes that much more important. And young journalists are in danger of leaping. It's even a problem with the budget. There are changes with how the budget formats are from year to year, and when people don't realize it, they jump in and make some really dangerous mistakes. And I have great sympathy, because what it means is that even people with an interest sometimes have to tread carefully, because they're very worried that they're missing something important. So it's a big problem. Professor Muralidharan, starting from the fact that in the section on crimes against women, there was a sudden change from the denominator being the total population to being women alone. And it could have did lead to enormously embarrassing stories in the media that were literally, I mean, the numbers were just off by exactly that, the entire male population. So it's a minefield. Yeah.
All right. One question from a student. This is for both, I think. Data stories often need a team to work on the story. Journalists, academia, and designers for visualization. How do we overcome this challenge? This is from our student, Arunasri Maganti. Steve, do you want to come in on this? She's talking about the struggles of forming a team with regard to visualization and working on the story.
Yeah, that putting together a team that can work well and all have the same goal can be a challenge, because very often, for instance, journalists and academics may have entirely different time scales in mind. When I want to work on a story, I want to be able to publish it tomorrow. They be more interested in, doing lots more analysis and then doing peer review and a whole variety of other things that are important in the academic world. So it's important to make sure that when you do build a team, that everybody is working, I guess, with the same understanding of what the parameters are going to be. And again, frankly, that's one reason that I try to keep all those elements in-house, inside the newsroom. When you start going outside to get an academic expert or somebody else to work with you, it may take some training on your part to show them that the standards for getting a good story done in journalism are different than getting a good academic study published in a journal that may not show up for 2 years later before it finally gets published.
I have to say a few words about the program, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Shalini, because also it's getting so late in Phoenix, so I don't want to keep you all up. So quickly about the program. The program is for working professionals to upgrade their skills. It's also for recent graduates to continue their college education, get more of an university education and become internationally compatible. There are 7 core courses. We have data journalism in the newsroom, which will basically be a survey course that walks you through many of the projects that Professors Doig and Ms. Srinivasan were also talking about, such as the first 100 project for ProPublica which was based in Chicago, which many of my students actually are very fond of. They did it in their class this year. And then we have ethical challenges in reporting with data. We have data fundamentals, which will walk you through stats. It's like a master's level statistics, economics, finance class, but mostly to deal with, how to crunch data, how to analyze it. Then we have data analysis with R. So we do have, some advanced training in advanced statistical software, which is open source. We also have a course on data visualization with Tableau. We have Tableau facilities on campus, and you can also post to Tableau Public, but we actually have Tableau between JSJC and JSBF, which is pretty fun. At the same, as students will do our Tableau course, our data visualization course, they will also be earning a certificate in Tableau. But I think Shalini will talk a little more about that. It is Shalini's baby. Then we have multimedia storytelling, which is, of course, it'll be using all of JSJC's facilities. We have a state-of-the-art radio station. We have a state-of-the-art radio studio. We have a state-of-the-art TV studio, which will be used to do the multimedia storytelling course. There's also a big basket of electives to choose from. What I'm most excited about is the data feminism course, where we are going to be talking about the gender aspect within data. Also because women tend to be invisibilized in the statistics very often. Right. Then we also have courses in public policy, trade policy, healthcare, labor, and environment, depending on where journalists want to position themselves. So before I go any further, I will now like to hand over to my colleague Shalini Goel to give in her concluding remarks.
Yeah, hi, thanks Ruchira. Hi everyone. So I'll just keep it quick because we have 8 minutes left for the session to end. Thank you very much to all the speakers. And I'm very happy to hear Professor Doig and Ms. Rukmini Srinivasan. And it really makes me happy because, Professor Doig talked a lot about Excel and, the skills that, that being the most important skill that a data journalist or any person working with data should have. And, to my delight and to Professor Sjjc's delight and everybody else's delight at the university, so we started our JSBF, the Jindal School of Banking and Finance, the school that I'm part of 3 years ago. And I've been teaching a course on my data analysis using Microsoft Excel to first semester students. And it has been very successful. We've got like amazing feedback from the, the industry folks where our students go for internships. And when I do my class, I tell them not to, think about the Excel features to cram up, but to, learn to take out the story from any data that you have at hand. So those are the kind of skills we are already doing, imparting to our students. And the same would be the, way of working with the data journalism program. And then there is also a Tableau course that Ruchira briefly talked about. And this is coming to Rukmini's point on, pre and post, reporting of infectious cases post-vaccination, right? So in my previous course, previous semester that just ended, we had the Tableau course for my second year students. And in the project, some students had the COVID data that Tableau provides, the same data, Rukmini, that you're talking about. Tableau has that for each country and, as granular as they can get. And students reported, they did the animation themselves. So how the dot moves from, March until now and, which country is going up and down. So I'll be very excited to, do it now. I mean, I'm going to do this course now next semester and hopefully in the data journalism course as well, where because now we have the vaccination, we'll be, very excited to see how the numbers now drop after the vaccination started this month or last month in some countries. So yeah, so we're really looking forward to it, and we have those things in mind and those challenges in mind. And we are, targeting ourselves to equip the students that come to us with those kind of skills that are essential for any data related skill, and especially data journalism. So that is going to be one important part. And then there are sessions on big data, the elective sessions that Ruchira mentioned about. And there are some sessions on predictive analytics. So for instance, if a policy analyst, or a journalist working on the policy side was to take this course, he would not just be able to make a visualization of the current courses, which is also, I think, related to one of the questions, but he would also be able to predict, and not everybody has to do this, but whoever is interested can take that course. And they'd also be able to predict these cases, going forward, and could get their states or, their organizations ready for the future because they're able to predict it. All right, and with those skills. So we are really excited and looking forward to it. And finally, because we don't have much time now, I also want to thank everybody involved in, coming up with this great course. especially the university administration involving the vice chancellor and the registrar and everybody else involved, the deans and everybody, for giving us this space to come up with that sort of a interconnected course between two very varied schools, otherwise the journalism school and the general school of banking and finance, to come up with a course like that where we could come together and talk about what is common and how we can use our strengths. For instance, Ruchira and I have been in conversations a lot. So how a journalist and not a journalist, but she's teaching journalist students, so I would still call her different than me in that respect, and how we've come together and come up with this course, and for bringing something to the population, to the Indian population, that kind of a course, and to the deans, of course, for guiding us and for brainstorming with us and ultimately covering all of this that we've talked about. And again, I'm very happy to say that we do plan to cover some of these challenges that both the speakers have talked about in the Indian context. So there's a session, for instance, on gathering data. So we'll equip the students, or we'll train the students on how to gather data from what public sources, and if not public sources, what sort of data can you gather by going onto the field and so on. Yeah, so with that, I would like to end. And again, thanks everyone, and we're really excited.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure, everybody. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rukmani. Okay. All right. Right.